Hi, everybody. This is Kevin Eikenberry, and I'm here to help you reach your potential as a leader and a human being. Welcome to Live with Kevin. And my guest today is Bobby Herrera. You're going to love getting to know Bobby. Bobby is the president and co-founder, I believe, of the Populous Group, a employment firm. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But here's what I want to tell you about Bobby. He's an author. He's a leader. He's a military veteran. He's been a past guest on my podcast, and he is one of the kindest, wisest guys that I've ever met, that I've never actually met. And I'm so excited that he's here with us today to talk about a topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is culture. And I'm going to have him talk a little bit about their company culture in just a second, because that'll give context for why it's so valuable for him to join us and for us to talk about how we deal with culture and how it's being impacted during all of this hubbub. How about that? During all of the hubbub, all of the pandemic, whatever you want to call it, that we're all living in now. So first of all, welcome, Bobby. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for the kind words. I'm over here blushing a little bit.
Well, it looks good on you. So that's good. So tell us a little bit about the Populous Group. You are in the contingent workforce business, right? I mean, that's what I would call it. Tell us about what you guys do, and then tell us about the culture there a little bit.
Yeah, so we'll start with the boring stuff, right? So, I simplify it down to, we help companies better manage their non-permanent workforce. Most organizations, in a sense, manage two distinct workforces: their permanent workforce, and they usually have a great grip on that, and then it's their non-permanent workforce. And that tends to cause a lot of frustration and angst, because that population's treated differently. You have independent contractors, you have temporary workers, you have foreign nationals. Everyone's heard all the acronyms about the gig economy. And it's frustrating because organizations have to figure out how to handle and treat them all differently. And so basically we come in and help them do that better, more efficiently, and so they can focus on the big problems that they have actually committed to solve for the world.
So we're going to talk about culture and the culture there, but I'm just going to start with this question. So from a documentation, from an HR perspective, you said we can handle them differently. I agree with that.
Yeah.
100%. And yet from a culture perspective, as a leader, how differently should we treat them? Like, talk to us about that a little bit.
That's a great question. One of the trends that I've seen during this, hubbub that you mentioned a while ago, depending on the industry, depending on the organization, there's been a lot of segregation between those two populations. And I believe it's more unintentional than actual intentional. But, what I've seen during the last few months is I've actually seen that divide get closer together, and there's been a significant rise in humanity and compassion in terms of how these non-permanent workers have been treated, which is wonderful to see, because they're moms and dads and brothers and sisters, and they have a heartbeat too. So it's been wonderful to see that rise in humanity, to treat these non-permanent folks with a lot more compassion. But generally speaking, they tend to often fall into a bit of an invisible workforce because they're so project driven. They come and go, and in my experience, my observation's been that the culture is usually kept as a separate piece of their identity. Not always the case, but that tends to be more of the observation than not.
We could have a whole conversation right there. I got like 12 questions I'd love to ask, but that's not what we promised people. So, we met leading up to the release of your book, The Gift of Struggle, which is a fabulous book. We'll talk a little bit more about it before we're done. But through that process, you shared with me a lot about your company culture, shared the video that you have created multiple times, called The Culture Code. And so as context for where we're headed, and as I promised actually earlier, I want you to tell us a little bit about the culture at the Populous Group. Would you do that?
Sure. At our core, we believe that everyone deserves an opportunity to succeed. That stems from me being a pro fan of the underdog. My life was changed by a kind act when I was 17. That moment gave me purpose, identity. I talk about that in the first chapter of the book, and on your podcast is the bus story. So
before he goes on, I have to tell you, before he goes on, if you read the book, if you pick up the book and read the first chapter, I dare you to not want to read the rest of the book. I think I said that before, but I dare you to read the first chapter, to read the bus story and not want to read the rest of this book. So anyway, on that note, I'll let you continue.
And that drives that core belief, that purpose. So at our core, that's why we exist. And we're driven. We bring that core belief to life through the boundaries that I've built over time in our culture that you just referenced as our culture code. And it's a 3-part culture code. The first part is give more than you take. The second part is speak from the heart. And the last part is go off the beaten path. And so those are our cultural pillars, which in English, what that means is anyone that's ever selected to become a part of our community. And I want to highlight selected and community. We can talk about that in a minute. Those are the boundaries and how we expect for you to behave while you're part of our community. Behaving and by following those 3 cultural pillars, it's going to keep you very safe, engaged, and very successful in our community. Absent of that, you're going to drive yourself crazy. You're going to drive us crazy, and that's not going to be good for either one of us. So we'll probably ask you to go take your talent somewhere else if you can't fulfill that cultural code. So we've been maniacal about that for years.
And you have, like me, been leading a remote team or virtual team pretty much all along, right? This is a virtually driven organization largely, correct?
Well, so there's a yes and a no to that. I do have 5 core locations across the country. They're fairly large, both East, West, Midwest. However, we also have I'd say about 25% of our workforce has been remote.
Okay.
Now, a backstory to that, my executive team has been remote for me pretty much since the beginning. And I've intentionally placed us in remote locations across the country so that we could really stay on the front lines of the culture of the people. And, it's challenged us with our rhythms and our communication and us having to over communicate. But what's the best that can happen when you put yourself in a position to over communicate, right?
Yeah, it's true. So when we were chatting before we started, I wondered if you'd be willing, because of the work that your group does, to talk a little bit about what you're seeing. And we're going to dive definitely into culture, everybody, but I'd really love for you to talk a little bit about what are your customers saying? What are you hearing about? What are you seeing coming in the coming months in terms of employment and the workforce and how all that's going to fit together? Like, do you have any insights or thoughts that might be useful to others? Again, before we dive into culture specifically.
Yeah, I think I could share some simple observations, Kevin. I think if we rewind the clock a few months ago, there was mass chaos. We had hundreds of customers across the country responding differently. So once we got through that part of it, what we have seen is over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks, it's been very reassuring because we've seen it level out pretty significantly. Actually, we have started to see an upward trend the last couple of weeks, which is very reassuring because we tend to be on the front line. We have a front row seat.
Yeah, you're a leading indicator.
Helping organizations manage a flexible workforce. A lot of organizations out there are going to be very reluctant right now to start bringing people back full time too soon. So while they're strategic about it, looking at their decisions, now assessing where they need to start ramping up, now that people have adjusted a little bit, they're starting to reach out to organizations like ours saying, hey, we have pre-identified populations of X, or we have this project, we're going to start bringing people in before we start the permanent workforce. And so across the board, we're starting to see that go a little bit. I think signaling that there's confidence building in how everyone's adjusting to this.
So we got a question that came in from Facebook that relates to this, and the question is: will business models change as well? Like, what are you hearing your customers say? I mean, obviously they're being cautious and they're bringing in some temporary folks first. But are you getting any sense? I mean, any thoughts to this question specifically?
I think that's a great question, Kevin. You know, I'm on the supplier advisory board of a large medical manufacturer. Been on the front lines of this from go, doubling production, and as organizations have responded differently, you know, my opinion is that there's going to be three phases to this. One, there's going to be the pay to survive, which depending on the industry, people are still in. Then there's going to be the recovery period, which starts to hint to this question, okay? How do we recover? How do we gather our breath, figure out, you know, the internal choices that we've made? But then there's a last part, which I think speaks to this question. How do we reframe this experience? Like all these struggles that we had, all these things that we were thrown into, how is that reframing in our business? And undoubtedly, I am seeing even these large medical manufacturers, you know, I'm on these calls where they're having to change their complete model of delivery on a global scale. And it's been very challenging. This one organization manages 52,000 suppliers in their ecosystem. Like they're the end manufacturer, and underneath them, there are 52,000 suppliers. So just beginning to imagine the complexity of that can be mind-boggling. And that's one example. Auto manufacturers are having to do that. You know, we're seeing a significant trend of insourcing. So in other words, a lot of organizations who had previously outsourced like call centers, we're seeing those come back to the US because they feel they can trust their operational structure in terms of how they're responding to this. Now that may not be long term, but what we're hearing is that it's changing the way they're looking at a lot of those segments of business.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. So now let's shift back to what we promised everybody, which is talking about the connection between, you know, everything pandemic related and culture. And that's what led me to reach out to you last week and for us to have a conversation. And so I'm curious from your perspective. And again, not only from the work that you do with your own culture, but because you have the opportunity to see into so many other organizations, how have you seen cultures being tested by this instantly sending everybody to work from home, right? And or furloughing people and all those things? Like, how have cultures been tested from your perspective during all this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple of things of context, Kevin. Yeah. To build a meaningful, purpose-driven, long-standing, healthy culture, like over time, you have to do three things. Number one, you have to build identity, you have to guide behavior, and you have to speak a common language. So that's permission to play if, as a leader, you want to build a sustainable, healthy, purpose-driven, long-term, healthy culture. All right, so let's put that to the side a moment. Under normal conditions, that's hard to do because that requires us as leaders to stay the course, to be compassionate, to be patient, to always message and tell stories and, you know, do the fundamentals of leadership. Well, the last couple of months when the stuff's hit the fan, I have seen a significant amount of cultures get unintentionally put to the side, and those very important behaviors, and that causes digression in the culture quickly. Right? So a metaphor often used, like, okay, so imagine if your family experienced an emergency, and all those things and those values that you upheld as a family stopped happening for several months, how would the family feel in a month or two? It would feel different. And I think a lot of organizations are experiencing that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So, even if an organization was, and the leaders in the organization were focused on managing, maintaining, building, continuing, nurturing that culture, even if they were doing that, which we both know most weren't, but even if people were, the first thing you said is they got to be focused on it. And all these other things have taken our focus as leaders other places. And if we don't keep a piece of it there, we run a big risk. I think to your point, I think that's super important. So
and a point to that, Kevin, if I may, is it's exhausting to do that. Just like, it takes effort to be kind. It takes effort to be a patient parent. It takes effort to be that person that you want to be. That's exhausting, right? So often you will put that stuff that builds the health to the side, and you'll focus on the business. I call it the sexy side of the business, where you can hide in the books and stuff. Well, organizations that were staying the course and pushing through the exhausting part of that, right now, the way cultures have really been tested is they're seeing either the fruits of their persistence or the unintentional oversights that they haven't been doing are really exposing them right now. So that's where I think the real danger exists. It's like a lot of organizations are facing the truth, the cultural truth right now because of either what they have or haven't been doing.
Yeah, so cultures are being tested. They're being exposed. They're being laid to bear, right? Without question. We got a question, and I'm going to ask part of it because I think part of it we've now talked about from a friend, a fellow Boilermaker with me, Rob Zimmerman, who is asking. He said, so I'll just read the whole question. We've talked about some of it. I'll let you take it wherever you want. So Rob says from LinkedIn, it seems like organizational cultures are revealed during crises. We've not talked about that. Do you fight for the good of your people or lay them off to cut costs? Do you trust your people to work remotely, or do you try to micromanage and control them? So again, that's just what we've been talking about. But either of those things, raise anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think there's some really good questions embedded even inside of those questions, Kevin. The biggest takeaway that I heard there from Ron was, hey, to what depths have they really been tested? And you and I talked about this offline, is, if you don't trust your people when they're with you, like, are they a different person when they leave? Like, that's a different conversation, right? So remote leadership and, leadership in general is not about whether you...
Oh, we lost you. We lost your sound.
Oh, you did?
No, you're back now. Whatever happened is back. So
lost
go ahead. You were talking about
if they leave. The point of the interview.
Yeah. So if people, if we can't trust them when they're here, we're certainly not going to trust them when they leave. And if we trust them now when they're here, why would that have to change? People often say to me, "Well, I can't see them working." Like, you can't see them working if they're in the cubicle next to you, unless you're looking over their shoulder. You just know they're doing something. There's an implicit level of trust that has to be there, and if it's not, it's going to be exposed for sure.
Sure, and some of the other thoughts that Ron's question provoked with, now organizations, because they've been so, I learned a term in the military called, managing the VUCA, and VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Organizations were so thrown off by trying to figure out how they're going to manage the VUCA that what they unintentionally have overlooked is that, hey, continuing to guide behavior, continuing to build identity, continuing to speak, do the things that your common language speak, you have to keep signaling that stuff. Right? That's the stuff that gets you through these crises. And organizations, my observation has been that most have unintentionally, I keep saying unintentionally because they're just trying to do their best and figure out some of these business problems. Well, the last thing they thinking they need to do is make this look at this. They're looking at it as an or instead of an and.
Right. I gotta focus on this stuff. And so I have to let something go. I'm going to choose to let it go, as opposed to figuring out how I get it all in the same bucket. So you've been living through it too, right? You had 100 customers who you said were, all going crazy, trying to do different stuff. And you guys had to manage your business too. So I would ask this question: what have you learned, you and your team learned about your culture in the last few weeks? And how have you tried to be intentional about the stuff that you've been talking about?
Yeah, great question. Just like everyone else, ours was tested too. And I was very pleased with how we had stood up to the test. And it's been exhausting for me personally to continue to build these cultural signals into everything that I've done. So, for example, when the VUCA first hit, when the chaos first hit, one of the first things that I did was I repurposed us to, I looked at our identity and said, hey, this is who we are, and this is what we're focused on for the next 30 days. So even though I was changing the focus of the organization, in my messaging, I kept reminding people, hey, at our core, this is who we are. We believe everyone deserves an opportunity to succeed. So our core purpose right now is to keep our community safe and to keep as many people employed as possible in the next 30 to 60 days. That's it. And then all my follow-up communications would have another cultural signal built into it. But everything that they heard from me was signaling something either about our culture code, something about our purpose, something about our identity. I built messaging about those important cultural specifics into everything that I send out.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you tried to stay true to what you have always done, and while it was hard, it was worth it. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, exactly. I think most parents that have children can experience this. I'm going to use another parenting metaphor. At a certain point in time, either your kids or a friend of yours will finally say something or do something that you've been repeating to them for years. And one of the things that I feel very so grateful about is all those messages and all those behaviors that I've just been driving people crazy about for years. All of a sudden now is like my children are saying, oh, now I know what this means. Now I get it. And they're saying things that I'm back here saying, oh, yes, what a novel idea. But, you have to,
the most powerful learning is discovery learning. So they think they're discovering it. It's fine. It's fine. It just means we're doing our job, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This means we're doing our job.
What's that phrase? When the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the thing. My father has passed away 13 years ago, last week. And my wife, at least once a week, she says, well, there's your dad. There he is again. There he is again. So it's not just when the kid is little or, the age of mine. So she says, well, there's Phil again. She says it to me all the time. Maybe not all in a positive way. I'll just say that. I know that we're getting some more questions, and we may not get to all of them. And if we don't, I apologize. But I want to comment. So Rob is following up and saying it, and I'm just reading this. I haven't read it ahead. So Rob, my observation is that we say we trust them, but now we have to prove it. Some are passing the test of good culture and some are not. I like the idea of keep signaling your desired culture. The circumstances have changed, but the signals shouldn't. I think he's got what you're saying, right?
No doubt. And it has to remain consistent. Consistency on the theme of trust consistency is one of those pillars. Right? People will forgive our imperfections as long as we're consistent. And, we've continued to try, the stream always wins. So, I mean, that's actually the heart of what we're talking about. Like, be the stream. Keep signaling. Keep signaling. You're going to have imperfections. Own those and just keep doing it.
If you're loving what you're hearing, here's where you can go to learn more about Bobby's book, The Gift of Struggle, Life-Changing Lessons About Leading, and other, I don't know what all you've got there. I haven't been there in a while. Anything else there that people need to go see besides that?
Yeah, you know what I've started doing that's been very helpful and fulfilling for me is I started, in the book I talk about my Bible row. It's in the lesson, Always Be a Student, and Bible row is my collection of those books that helped me through my biggest business struggles and who I've chosen to learn from. I actually just started a Bible row series where I'm specifically picking a book off my Bible row. I'm sharing a struggle that I had, a big question that I had, and the gift that I ultimately got from the lesson that I took from, fiercely applying what I learned from that. So it's been a real popular series right now.
And that, as actually seeing one of those, is what gave me the aha moment that you should be here. And so, quite honestly, I saw it on LinkedIn. I'm like, hey, that gives me a really good idea. And I'm certainly glad we did that. Before we wrap up, though, I want to ask one more question, because we've talked a lot about what we can be doing to signal, what we can be doing to communicate. But let's say that maybe we came into this and our culture wasn't quite what we wanted. Or let's say that as an organization, we were intentionally working on an aspirational culture. We were trying to move there, right? We weren't where we wanted to be. So that leads to, I think, our last question. What can leaders intentionally do now to improve their culture? So maybe we didn't love where we were, but how can we use this time to help us for the future as it relates to culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin, because situationally applied, as we look at our culture, I mean, we really need to ask ourselves some very intentional, deep questions. In the chapter that I share in the book, first and foremost, a big mistake that I made is I never shared what I imagined. Right? And that's why I lead with a story of how I had explained the culture that I wanted to build to my wife, but I'd never shared it with anyone in my company, any one of my leaders. So the first thing I would encourage leaders to ask themselves is, okay, what is it that you imagine? Like, if you could stop the world and look forward, what do you imagine? How do you want it to feel? How do you want it to look? How do you want people to feel about the environment you created? Start there. And then once you do that, then you can self-assess. How well do people know what I imagine? How can they help me? And take that first step to ask them for help. I mean, that's one of the strongest signals of leadership, isn't it? It's like asking those you trust for help. Like, this is what I've imagined, but this is where I think we really are. How can we get there?
So let me just take that statement you just made, asking people we trust for help. I would just say that the light bulb that went off for me when you said that was, when we ask for their help, it shows that we trust them.
So few better signals. There's few better signals for building trust than asking someone for help.
Yep. And so we're letting them know through our actions. At the end of the day, that's all that matters, right? Is what are we doing? How are they? And in fact, that's how people know we trust them, is by what we do. Mm-hmm. And the questions that we ask is certainly one of those things. Trust. Go ahead.
And Kevin, then they can decide whether or not they want to be a part of it. The mistake that I made was, not only had I not shared what I imagined, a byproduct of that was absence of that narrative, right? Because as a leader, that's what we're doing. We're narrating a story. And at the heart of that story is painting that picture for people of that culture that you imagine. Absent of that, people are going to paint their own picture. And so there was a gap. And I simply asked them, how do we close that gap? This is what I imagine. This is what I feel. This is what is in my heart. This is what I see of where we actually are. What do you see? And how do we close it? Like, talk about bringing a community together. That's what I call the flap of the butterfly wing for my organization. When I did that, that's when I saw my company start to transform into a community. And there's a big difference. We talked about, let's bookmark that, talk about that later.
Well, we could bookmark and talk about a lot of things. So I'm going to probably have to bring you back again someday in the future, but we probably need to wrap up for today. I want to just thank you, Bobby, so much for being here. And I knew that we would have a good time. In fact, before we started, you said, well, I know we'll have fun, Kevin. So I think we succeeded at that. And hopefully we helped people with some tangible things, but also some things to be pondering and to think about. That's been my hope. And any final thoughts that you have before we go?
I always end our chats with hail the underdogs, and I hope this serves somebody, and they got it. So keep climbing with style.
All right. Well, thank you, Bobby, and thank you all of you for being here. We'll be back in a couple of days. Jones Laughlin, we're going to talk about the overwhelm of all of this and how do we deal with that in our work and in our lives. We're going to do that in a couple of days. But for now, Bobby, thank you again for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. And for all of you that are watching, if you're watching later, which many of you will, if you've got other questions, put them in there. We'll see if we can get answers for you one way or another. And if you're watching later and you loved it, well, by all means, share it and have other people gain the same opportunity that you've had. Thanks again, everybody, for being here. I'll end the way I try to end all of these days. Be well, be safe, be remarkable. Thanks, everybody.